This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Masterworks. Art history is its own thing, and to tell you the truth, it's not really my thing. The development of the visual arts and critique of art certainly deserves to be remembered. It just doesn't happen to be my speciality, but art can represent history. It's a powerful way that history is recorded. Sometimes art becomes history itself. And the artist John Singer Sargent was something of a rarity in that he achieved recognition and success during his lifetime. He was controversial in terms of art history. He was known for realism in an era when experimental forms like impressionism and cubism were in vogue. He was an intriguing person, intensely private and almost a man without a country. But above all, his prodigious body of work illustrated the time in which he lived, a time that deserves to be remembered. Art is a status symbol to both subjects and students, and with the time and effort artists put into their craft, it's not hard to see why. Whether patrons truly understand the art or not, they can understand its value. It's one reason why, for centuries, the wealthiest members of society have enlisted artists like Sargent. It's why museums have paid millions to put it on display, and it's why years after an artist's death, their work sells for millions of dollars. But art's potential may hold value outside a sentimental realm. Like a vintage car or a bottle of wine, high-quality artwork can gain value over time. And unlike stocks, bonds, and real estate, its value is less likely to be affected by wider economic trends. So in addition to the prestige aspect, art can be a savvy financial investment. Until recently, investing in art was reserved for the wealthiest members of society. But with the award-winning platform Masterworks, now almost anyone can diversify their investments with blue-chip, museum-grade art for a fraction of the cost. And to be clear, this isn't digital art. It's household names like Picasso and Basquiat and Banksy, artists with a track record of price appreciation. In 8 of their last 9 exits, Masterworks has delivered net returns of over 13.9% to their investors. Nearly 600,000 people have signed up so far, and offerings have often sold out in minutes. But my subscribers can get priority access by using the link in the description. John Singer Sargent was born in Florence, Italy, January 12, 1856. The descendant of a distinguished Massachusetts family, his father, a Philadelphia eye surgeon, and mother went to Europe on vacation and ended up never returning to the United States, becoming what has been described as nomadic expatriates, living on a small inheritance and savings. John's early life was certainly unconventional, traveling with his parents and receiving little formal schooling, but his parents were intelligent, educated people, and he was described as both highly literate and cosmopolitan. He was fluent in English, French, Italian, and German. He showed artistic talent from a young age, an interest that drew him to Paris, where he studied under portrait artist Carlos Duran, painted here in 1879 by his student and in the collection of the Clark in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Sargent's work was prolific, painting over the course of his career nearly 900 oil paintings and thousands of watercolors, in addition to thousands of sketches in charcoal. His technical skill was highly regarded. The famous sculptor Auguste Rodin called him the Van Dyck of his time, referring to the 17th century Flemish master Anthony van Dyck, although he did receive criticism in the contemporary art community, where his realism was seen more as craft than art. It was a period of avant-garde art when styles like impressionism and cubism were more in vogue. The criticism is perhaps overstated, in that Sargent certainly demonstrated proficiency in these forms. This is, in fact, an 1885 painting by Sargent in the Impressionist style of Impressionist master Claude Monet, painting by the edge of the wood, which typifies the Impressionist style of painting directly from nature, now on display at the Tate Museum in London. The two were good friends. Notably, though, he kept this painting in his private collection, didn't display it publicly until after his death. Now, that might be because he had a personal affinity for Monet, but it also might say something about Sargent and his times. Retrospectives, especially ones looking at pieces of art that weren't displayed during his lifetime, suggested that he was adept at many different styles and many different media, and was willing to take significant risks in terms of subject matter. But he was very careful about the works that he displayed in order to protect his reputation and his income. And that says a lot about the era in which he lived. And that shows in what is today considered possibly his greatest work, Portrait of Madame X, painted in 1884. American expatriate Virginie Emilie Evigneau Goutreau was a Paris socialite, married to a French banker. A popular socialite, the it girl of Paris at the time, the portrait was not commissioned, but rather done at Sargent's suggestion, assuming that a painting of the famous beauty would be popular. He wrote a friend in Paris, "I have a great desire to paint her portrait. I have reason to think she would allow it, and is waiting for someone to propose this homage to her beauty. If you are bien avec elle and will see her in Paris, you might tell her I am a man of prodigious talent." She eventually accepted his request to paint her, possibly because they shared an affinity, both being American expatriates. Goutrou was said to be extremely fond of the work, and Sargent thought it a masterpiece, certain to cement his artistic reputation. Instead, when displayed at the Paris Salon, the painting created a scandal. At issue was the right strap to Madame Goutrou's dress, which was displayed askew, suggesting that she had perhaps just engaged in activity that would have had her dress removed. One art critic complained, "One more struggle, and the lady will be free." The painting so scandalized Goutrou that she removed herself from society. Her mother was so upset that she demanded that Sargent remove the painting. He refused, but he changed its name from Portrait of Madame Asterix, which suggested a real person, to Portrait of Madame X, suggesting an archetype. The controversy was important to Sargent's career, compelled him to abandon Paris and move to London, where he would become one of the most sought-after portrait painters in the world. But it also represented the sensibilities of the Victorian era, when the placement of a dress strap could signal the difference between masterpiece and scandal. There is perhaps no better representation of the changing times than the fact that when Gustave Courtois painted Goutrou in a dress that showed more skin and had a more scandalous strap just 7 years later, it was well received. Sargent later painted over the offending strap and repositioned it. Today it is considered a masterpiece and one of Sargent's greatest works, and Sargent himself remarked that, "I suppose it is the best thing I have done." He displayed the work prominently in his studio, sold it to the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1916 after Goutrou's death, where it resides today. While his work was not immediately embraced in London, he would eventually become one of the most celebrated portrait artists of his time. In particular, he became highly sought after by the wealthy of the Gilded Age and commanded a commission high enough to live in comfort. The comparison, however, of the works in this period of fame to Madame X shows why, to preserve that comfort, he kept his more daring work out of public display, and again shows the nature of Victorian sensibilities. As his fame grew, he painted numerous important people of his time. One of my favorites is this painting of Field Marshal Frederick Sleigh Roberts, painted in 1906 and in the collection of the National Gallery in London. One of my early fascinations in history was the British Victorian Army, the thin red line that somehow preserved the largest empire the world has ever known. Sargent, whose portraits were known for representing the personality of his subject, shows the famously serious field marshal in all his medal-bedecked glory and masculinity. Perhaps no single work better represents the ideal of the British Victorian Army than this. And perhaps there is no greater way to contrast the differing views of the military than his work of American General Leonard Wood, painting in 1903 and in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian Institution. And if a portrait can truly represent the personality of the subject, then this is perhaps the best example, also painted in 1903. When invited to paint the famously active and restless chief executive, Sargent could not find a place on the first floor of the White House where the light was right. Roosevelt became notably annoyed at the time taken, and as they walked up the stairs towards the second floor, the two began to argue. Roosevelt purportedly said, annoyed, that Sargent did not understand what the president wanted, and Sargent replied that Roosevelt apparently did not understand what was involved in posing for a portrait. Roosevelt's temper flared. He turned at the stairs landing and retorted, "Don't I?" And so the portrait shows the famous stalwart, hand on hip in proud defiance, on the landing of the staircase. Don't I, indeed. Roosevelt loved it, and it's his official portrait in the collection of the White House, Washington, D.C. And if a portrait can represent history, then his painting of President Woodrow Wilson, done in 1917, might be it. Sargent explained the circumstances of the commission in a letter. Irish art dealer Hugh Lane had promised Sargent that he would donate £10,000 to the Red Cross if he would paint a portrait. But Lane died before the commission, and his estate went to the National Gallery of Ireland, who, Sargent wrote, handed over the £10,000 to the Red Cross in 1916 and have lately decided the portrait should be that of President Wilson. There is a particular irony of history in the story. Wilson had run and won in the presidential election of 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," a notable achievement given the outcry over the 1915 sinking of the Lusitania by a German U-boat. Wilson's portrait, still in the collection of the National Gallery of Ireland, was painted due to the donation made to the Red Cross via Hugh Lane's estate, bequeathed because of his death. He was one of the 1,193 people whose lives were lost when the Lusitania was sunk. And of course, there can be paintings of history. If Sargent's portraits represented the innocence of the Victorian era, nothing shattered that innocence, like the Great War. According to the Imperial War Museum, in 1919, Sargent was commissioned by the British government to contribute the central painting for a Hall of Remembrance for World War I. He was given the theme of Anglo-American cooperation, but was unable to find a suitable subject matter and chose this scene instead. Artist Henry Tonks had traveled with Sargent to the battlefields of France in 1918 and told the story of the painting. After tea, we heard that on the Douyin Road at the Corps dressing station at Le Bac du Sud, there were a good many gases cases, so we went there. The dressing station was situated on the road and consisted of a number of huts and a few tents. Gases cases kept coming in, led along in parties of about 6, just as Sargent had depicted them, by an orderly. They sat or lay down on the grass. There must have been several hundred, evidently suffering a great deal, chiefly, I fancy, from their eyes, which were covered up by a piece of lint. Sargent was very struck by the scene and immediately made a lot of notes. The painting is one of the most dramatic to display the horrors of war that changed how the world viewed conflict. The Guardian newspaper wrote in 2018, "This vision of blighted youth is the polar opposite of Arc's grand old notions of noble, glorious warfare. They are the blind, leading the blind." The disability is emphasized with the soldier in the middle, making an exaggerated step, as if trying to traverse an unseen stair. The painting was so shocking that writer Virginia Woolf fled the gallery. Upon first viewing the painting in the collection of the Imperial War Museum, Sir Winston Churchill remarked, with all its brilliant genius and painful significance, how the field of national psychology must have been harrowed by events which had taken place during the war. Gases perhaps represents a change for Sargent as well. The Guardian continues, "Made when he was 62, it was completely unexpected from an artist known for flattering portraits of the beau monde. Art sometimes provides the clearest view of history." Later in life, he spent more time painting watercolors and landscapes, but he was most famous for his portraiture. And while his realist style received criticism from art circles, even there, he was representing history. There is a significant difference between the Gilded Age and a Golden Age. The term refers to the illusory nature of false opulence, of an era where some became fabulously wealthy while others were left in squalor. If Sargent represented the gold and gilding in his portraits, including John D. Rockefeller, styled the wealthiest American ever, painted in 1917 and held in a private collection. In 1980, an art critic wrote in Time magazine that he was the unrivaled recorder of male power and female beauty in a day that, like ours, paid excessive court to both. He perhaps reserved his greatest passion for the other side of the gilding. Always a world traveler like his parents, his huge collection of works includes passionate and intimate portraits of common life, from the streets of Venice to workers in a quarry. Sargent's works were always controversial in the art community, and as he aged, he was increasingly portrayed as being out of touch. But after his death in 1925 of a heart attack at age 69, many other works were discovered that showed that he was significantly more willing to take risks both artistically and socially. Perhaps learning a lesson from the controversy that surrounded the portrait of Madame X, he had kept those out of the public eye. His reputation has been rehabilitated more recently, and you might recognize many of his paintings, even if you don't know his name. The artist who found success in his own time has only grown more popular with time. In 1996, his 1908 work Kashmir sold at auction for $11 million. 2004, his 1885 work Portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson and his wife, depicting the author, who was a good friend of Sargent's, in what has been described as a very unportrait-like portrait, sold to casino mogul Steve Wynn for $8.8 million. In the same year, his 1905 work Group with Parasols, a siesta, sold to a private collector for $23.5 million. The cliche, "I don't know art, but I know what I like," is such a cliche that its origin is obscure. The first time it's known to have been in print was in a 1906 book of cliches. But sometimes it applies. If you're wondering why the history guy is talking about John Singer Sargent, the biggest reason is simply that I like his work. I don't know of another artist who so clearly encapsulated what it was like to live in his time. His paintings are part of what inspired my love of history. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.